When Scott bought his quiet Arizona retreat, he thought he'd found peace. But when an aggressive HOA tried to claim his land, his carport became ground zero for a war they never saw coming. Scott Miller had always dreamed of retiring somewhere quiet, someplace where the air smelled like sun-warmed earth, where neighbors waved but minded their own business, and where he could drink his morning coffee in peace. When he found the house on a corner lot in the outskirts of a sleepy Arizona suburb, he knew he'd struck gold. The property came with a wide gravel driveway, a detached garage, and a sturdy metal carport just off to the side, perfect for his old F-150, which he'd restored himself, and shaded enough to keep the desert heat at bay. The house itself was modest, but well built. A single-story ranch-style home, with terracotta tiles and wide eaves that cast long shadows on the stucco walls. The backyard stretched into a patch of desert scrubland that he maintained himself, dotted with succulents and one proud saguaro cactus that seemed to greet him every morning like an old friend. Best of all, the property was completely his. No HOA rules, no committees, no monthly dues. When he bought it 2 years ago, the realtor had proudly stated, "This is pure land, Scott. No strings attached." That suited him just fine. He spent his days doing exactly what he wanted, tinkering with motorcycles in the garage, going on long bike rides through the canyon trails, and occasionally lending a hand to the older couple next door when their lawnmower sputtered out. He didn't bother anyone, and no one bothered him. It was peace. Quiet. Golden peace. The kind you didn't realize was rare until you found it. Across the street, however, a new development had begun to sprout like weeds. Cactus Grove. A pristine, planned community of beige stucco homes and manicured front yards. Scott had watched the houses go up from a distance, mildly curious but mostly indifferent. He'd seen HOAs in action before. Petty squabbles over mailbox colors and hedge heights, and he wanted no part of it. As far as he was concerned, so long as they stayed on their side of the road, there'd be no problem. But as anyone who's dealt with power-hungry HOA boards could tell you, that kind of peace never lasts. For now, though, Scott relished his hard-earned freedom. He believed that, with his property lines clearly marked and his land clearly separate from the neighboring development, he would be left alone. His carport, nestled neatly inside his boundary and protected by decades-old zoning laws, was just another part of his sanctuary. He had no idea it was about to become ground zero for a ridiculous, infuriating battle over property rights, entitled bureaucracy, and one very persistent HOA. It started on a Monday morning, the kind of morning Scott usually enjoyed with a black cup of coffee, and the quiet hum of cicadas in the background. He stepped outside to check on his truck, only to stop dead in his tracks halfway down the porch, parked directly under his carport. His carport was a white utility van with bold blue letters on the side. Cactus Grove HOA Maintenance Division. He blinked, thinking maybe he was seeing things. But no, there it was, parked confidently in the shade, like it belonged there. A man in a neon vest sat in the driver's seat, sipping from a travel mug and tapping at a tablet balanced on his knee. Scott approached, his brow furrowed. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice even but clipped. The man looked up with casual indifference. "Morning. Just waiting on a crew. Got an install today. Security cameras at the Grove's front gate. Karen said to use the carport for staging." He gestured vaguely, like this was no big deal. Scott's eyes narrowed. Karen. "Yeah, HOA president. Said this spot's perfect. Close to the main road. Shade's a bonus." Scott folded his arms. "That's because it's my property. This isn't a community lot, and you've got no business parking here." The driver blinked, and frowned slightly, like Scott had just told him water wasn't wet. Wait, this isn't part of Cactus Grove? Nope, never was, never will be. You're trespassing. The man glanced around awkwardly, clearly thrown off. Huh. Karen said it was fine. Figured you were part of the older lots that got absorbed or something. Scott shook his head. Karen figured wrong. The man muttered something under his breath, tossed the tablet onto the passenger seat, and reversed the van out from under the carport. Dust kicked up as he sped off, and Scott stood there for a few moments longer, irritation simmering just beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, as if to confirm the absurdity of the morning, Scott found a paper wedged into his mailbox. It was an official communication from the Cactus Grove HOA. A printed notice with HOA letterhead and Karen Mitchell's signature scrawled at the bottom. The note began politely enough, but quickly turned condescending. Due to a lack of adequate staging areas for ongoing maintenance, we have identified the unused carport on your lot as an optimal location for temporary HOA vehicle parking. We appreciate your cooperation in supporting the greater community's needs and request that access be granted on an ongoing basis during daylight hours. Blocking access may be construed as obstruction to essential services. Scott read it twice, then a third time, almost laughing. Unused carport? That thing had housed his truck and gear for 2 years straight. The audacity was almost impressive. By sunset, he'd written his own response, firm, professional, and crystal clear. This is private property. I am not, nor have I ever been, part of Cactus Grove HOA. Further use of my land without consent will be considered trespassing and reported accordingly. He sent it via certified mail and made a copy for his records. He thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, a second letter arrived, this one more formal, more insistent, and noticeably less polite. It was a notice of intent to enforce community cooperation. Again, bearing Karen Mitchell's signature, now accompanied by a thinly veiled threat of legal escalation. The letter accused Scott of disrupting vital community operations and included language about spirit of neighborhood unity, failure to comply with reasonable requests, and, most bizarrely, public easement expectations. Apparently, in the HOA's view, Scott's carport, by virtue of its proximity to the street and historical adjacency to Cactus Grove, now fell under a sort of communal jurisdiction. Scott read the letter aloud in his kitchen, chuckling bitterly. Public easement expectations, he repeated, shaking his head. That's not how property law works. Just to be sure, he dug out his deed, property survey, and closing documents. Everything was as it had always been, the lot clearly defined, the carport entirely within his boundaries, and the words "no HOA affiliation" explicitly noted. He made high-resolution scans and filed them neatly in a new folder titled Karen's Nonsense. But the nonsense wasn't slowing down. The following afternoon, Scott returned from a hardware run to find a different HOA maintenance van tucked under his carport again. This time there was no driver in sight, just a pile of supplies in the back, a ladder leaning against the frame, and a clipboard resting on the hood of his truck. He stood there for a long moment, jaw tight, before picking up the clipboard and flipping through it. It contained a list of scheduled visits for the week. Each day marked Use Carport Staging Zone, Miller Lot. He was furious. The first incident could have been written off as a misunderstanding. This was calculated. He took photos of everything, then called the non-emergency line for the sheriff's department. A deputy came out within the hour, listened patiently as Scott explained the situation and nodded with a look that said, "Yep, another HOA overreach." The deputy agreed to log the incident as trespassing, noting that while no one was present at the moment, further occurrence could escalate into a criminal matter. Scott then posted 2 signs at the edge of his driveway, just before the entrance to the carport. In bold capital letters, "Private property, no trespassing, HO vehicles prohibited." Beneath it, a second smaller sign read, "Violators will be photographed and reported." The next day, the signs were gone, ripped from the ground and tossed behind his trash bins. Scott didn't hesitate. He drove to the nearest hardware store, bought new signs, this time metal ones, along with 2 motion sensor cameras and a security floodlight. That evening, he mounted everything in place and made sure the coverage was airtight. It was no longer just about convenience or shade. This was about control. The HOA had decided that his compliance was inevitable, and when he didn't roll over, they started treating his boundaries as optional. Scott wasn't just angry now. He was preparing for war. The breaking point came the following week. It was just past noon when Scott heard tires crunching over gravel. He looked out his window, expecting a delivery truck, but instead saw 2 patrol cars parked at the edge of his driveway. A pair of uniformed officers were stepping out, their hands casually resting on their belts. Scott frowned and opened the door, stepping onto his porch. "Afternoon, officers. Something wrong?" The taller of the 2 approached, his expression neutral but alert. "Sir, we received a call from the Cactus Grove HOA. They reported a possible altercation and obstruction of public service access. Are you Scott Miller?" Scott crossed his arms. "Yeah, I am. And I can already tell you this is complete nonsense." The second officer joined them, flipping through a notepad. "They claim you've been threatening HOA workers, verbally aggressive, and physically blocking maintenance crews from accessing community infrastructure." Scott stared for a beat, then let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're standing on private property. I'm not part of that HOA. They've been parking their vans under my carport without permission, ripping up my no trespassing signs, and ignoring repeated written notices to stay off my land. I haven't threatened anyone, but I have reported them for trespassing. Twice." He gestured toward the security camera above the porch. "Everything's recorded. You're welcome to review it." The officers exchanged a glance. One of them radioed back to dispatch for confirmation on property boundaries, while the other followed Scott into the house. He pulled up footage from the last few days, the white vans pulling in, workers unloading gear, the signs being yanked from the ground, the quiet fury on Scott's face as he stood by, arms crossed, making no move toward confrontation. When they returned to the driveway, the mood had shifted. The taller officer adjusted his belt. "Looks like you're in the clear, Mr. Miller. We spoke with county records. Your property is legally separate, not subject to HOAs. Jurisdiction." Scott let out a breath, nodding. Glad to hear someone's still reading maps properly. As the officers prepared to leave, another car came screeching around the corner and parked awkwardly across the street. Karen Mitchell herself stepped out, her heels crunching against the asphalt, sunglasses perched atop her helmet of hair. She marched toward the scene, waving a folder of papers. "Officers! I'm glad you're still here. This man is hostile and refuses to allow necessary access to community space. He's been—" "Ma'am," one officer interrupted firmly, "we've reviewed the property lines and security footage. Mr. Miller is within his rights. This is private property." Karen blinked, thrown off by the quick dismissal. "That carport is within the community zone. Look at this map." She shoved a document toward them, but Scott had already seen it before. The doctored HOA boundary map they'd mailed to him, redrawn to conveniently absorb his property. The officer glanced at it and sighed. "Ma'am, this doesn't match county records. Submitting falsified property documents is a serious matter." Karen's face flushed deep crimson. I was told this was accurate by our compliance manager." Scott stepped forward now, calm but resolute. "If your manager told you that, then maybe you should both be in court, because this ends now." The officers made no move to arrest anyone, but they did issue a formal report warning the HOA against further action. They also advised Karen that any future claims would be scrutinized, and that escalating false reports could result in criminal charges. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her confidence unraveling at the seams. Then she turned on her heel and walked briskly back to her car, slamming the door behind her. Scott watched the patrol cars pull away, then looked at the newly reinstalled metal signs, shining in the sun like badges of honor. He wasn't just defending his property anymore. He was exposing the rot behind a self-righteous HOA, and he had no intention of backing down. By the time the official cease and desist letter from the HOA's legal representative landed in Scott's mailbox, he was already 3 steps ahead. He had retained his own attorney, Lily Morgan, a sharp and no-nonsense specialist in property rights, who had built a reputation dismantling overreaching homeowners associations. When Scott laid out the details, the parking, the signs, the falsified documents, she didn't just nod. She smirked. "They tried to redraw the map?" she asked, flipping through the scanned copies Scott had provided. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Lily wasted no time filing a civil claim. Harassment, trespassing, defamation by way of false police reports, and attempted fraud through doctored property records. And because Cactus Grove HOA had acted under the direction of its president, the case named not only the organization, but Karen Mitchell personally. Within a week, subpoenas were issued. Within 2, depositions began. Scott stayed out of the spotlight as much as he could, letting Lily and her legal team do what they did best. But in the first court hearing, an emergency motion for injunctive relief, the judge didn't need much convincing. After reviewing the documentation, including original zoning maps, deed records, and video footage, the judge issued an order prohibiting the HOA from making any further contact with Scott or using his property in any capacity. Karen was in the courtroom that day. She didn't meet Scott's eyes once. But the real storm hit when discovery unearthed a trove of internal HOA emails. It turned out the idea to use Scott's carport hadn't come from a logistical necessity. It had been part of a broader, informal plan Karen had floated for months, a community utility expansion. Her emails described neighboring non-HOA properties as available space and referred to certain homeowners as uncooperative relics who needed to be encouraged to integrate. One message, sent just 2 days before the second incident under the carport, explicitly suggested, "If we act like it's already part of the development, eventually people will accept it." That quote alone lit the courtroom up. Karen's lawyer tried to spin it as theoretical brainstorming, but the judge wasn't buying it. With mounting evidence and mounting media attention, local outlets had picked up the story and were calling it Carport Gate. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting. Days later, Karen Mitchell was removed from her position as president, effective immediately. But the lawsuit was far from over. In the months that followed, Lily continued to push forward, and Scott remained patient. He wanted more than compensation. He wanted accountability. At trial, witness testimony from neighbors, some current, some former, painted a picture of an HOA culture that thrived on intimidation under Karen's rule. One couple described being fined for planting wildflowers. Another testified about threats for parking a trailer on their own gravel driveway. And then came the expert testimony. A zoning official from the county confirmed that Scott's property had never, at any point in history, been subject to HOA jurisdiction. The attempt to annex his land, even informally, was legally baseless and professionally irresponsible. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliberate. The verdict, in Scott's favor, on all counts. The court ordered the HOA to pay damages for property trespass and emotional distress, to cover Scott's legal fees, and, most importantly, to issue a public retraction of their false claims. The judge's final remarks were particularly biting. No community should function on coercion masquerading as cooperation. The defendant's rights were violated repeatedly, arrogantly, and without legal foundation. This court finds such behavior reprehensible. Scott didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He just nodded, shook Lily's hand, and walked out of the courthouse into the Arizona sun, knowing that justice had done what his carport had always done best, held the line. 2 weeks after the verdict, Scott stood in the soft morning light, watching as the final bolts were secured on a sleek, custom-built aluminum gate at the mouth of his driveway. The gate, operated by remote and backed by a high-definition security camera, swung silently into place with the final touch of a technician. It wasn't just protection, it was a statement. On its center panel, bold yet tasteful, was a sign that read, "Private property, no HOA access. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The neighborhood had gone quiet since the trial. Karen had all but disappeared from public view, her once feared reign reduced to murmurs at HOA meetings and awkward silences on morning walks. The board that remained was cooperative now, cautious to the point of reverence. An apologetic email had arrived from the interim president, full of carefully chosen words like regret, misunderstanding, and hope for future peace. Scott hadn't replied. Still, not everyone had turned their backs. Over the next few days, several neighbors stopped by, not with complaints or pressure, but with quiet nods of support. One elderly man from 2 streets over brought over a pie and confessed, "Wish I'd stood up to them the way you did." Another dropped off a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for reminding them that fences aren't always bad." Scott hadn't asked to be anyone's symbol. He just wanted his space, his rights, his peace, and now he had it. That weekend, he fired up the grill for the first time in months. No crowd, no guests, just the soft sizzle of meat, the desert wind rustling through the cactus garden, and the comforting hum of solitude. He leaned back in his patio chair, eyes half closed, the sky above wide and cloudless. Somewhere across the street, someone opened a garage door, a kid called for a dog, and the world continued like it always had. But Scott knew something fundamental had shifted. Not just in his corner of the block, but in the message, now etched into every inch of his gravel drive. This land was earned, defended, and undeniably his, and no one, not even an HOA, would ever park under his roof again.